Hey, everybody. Welcome to Latter-day Struggles. This is your host, Valerie, and I have Nathan with me. Hi, Nathan.
Hello.
Hey, so as promised, I wanted to come over here for a second run at this news that recently came over about no, it's not Relief Society. About ready to say Relief Society. About the Sunday School and how women are brand new, able to be in presidencies of the Ward Relief Society. And a lot of people reached out and asked if I would comment on this, because I think there's a lot of mixed feelings as usual. I think in some ways it's like, yeah, any news is good news in the realm of, women and any kind of participation or increased participation in an institutional patriarchy. And also, of course, there's a little bit of, itchiness, discomfort, frustration, disappointment, you name it. There's a lot of feelings here. So I did make a response comment. I did an Instagram live a few days ago, and as I was studying it, it occurred to me that there were two topics here, not just one. The one topic is the idea of reform itself and the nature of reform and what it possibly could mean. And so I'd invite you to go back to that first episode of this little series to explore that part with me. Like, what could this mean? And today's episode, I wanted to have Nathan along with me so that we could discuss this issue connected to the mixed gender piece, or shall I say the non-mixed gender piece, the fact that genders are not allowed to serve in presidencies together, because I thought that was really weird at the very beginning. When I read it, I was like, that's weird. And then I had a few other thoughts that emerged as far as like, why might they be doing that? And it occurred to me as I was planning the first episode that I thought, ooh, there's something here. There's something here. And I don't want to just like brush over this. And so today's episode is all about that piece. I'm going to read you the exact portion of the letter that was sent out just recently, a few days ago. It says this. This is the portion we're going to be tackling today. The First Presidency and Quorum of the 12 Apostles have determined that, effective immediately, the bishop may call a man or a woman to serve as Ward Sunday School president. If a man is called as Sunday School president, he must hold the Melchizedek priesthood, and his counselors and secretary must be male members of the ward. If a woman is called as Sunday School president, her counselors and secretary must be female members of the ward. Okay, close quote. Back to me and Nathan. Okay, Nathan, why don't you kick us off? First impressions.
Well, I mean, when I first heard that, my first thought was, okay, that's good. We're always looking for victories, even if they're small victories. And anytime that we see the patriarchy willing to give up some of its power and take a position that has been male only and open it to females, I think that's good. About the mixed gender, I thought that was weird. I immediately assumed, again, it just first glance, immediate first impression, I immediately assumed that this had something to do with, fear of creating, sexual tension and, just having a hotbed for adultery and fornication in the Sunday school. And so I thought, well, okay, clearly they still don't trust adults to be adults, but fine. Whatever. It is a process, and I guess we don't want the Sunday school to become a house of whores, because apparently that was my first thought, is what they were afraid of.
Okay, so I'm dying laughing over here because my first thought in response to your first thought was, well, at least Sunday school wouldn't be boring anymore if it's a hotbed of fornication and whoredom. So, oh my goodness. So yeah, that was my first impression too. My first impression was like, that's weird, which is funny because that's exactly what you said. And we weren't even like discussing this at the same time, but so that's weird. And then my same initial conclusion was that as well, that like, wow, like, so if we're in a presidency together, that is like maybe like the slippery slope. Like if you're talking a lot to people of the other gender, then we are creating a situation that could invite eventual adultery or something like that. And yet at the same time, as I kept thinking about that, and as you and I kept talking about that, the interesting thing is, if that really were the only fear, then that quite frankly is already happening. And I don't mean the fornication part. I mean, I guess that probably is too. But I just go back to my days as a Relief Society president many years ago, and I was in constant communication with the bishop of the ward. And I was very close in many, if not, I mean, it's hard to say most decisions, because of course the ones I wasn't involved in, I didn't know about, but I will say, and he told me we served for pretty much our full tenure together for about 5 years together, that I was heavily involved in a lot of what was going on the ward level. And we were in communication almost daily and met all of the time and collaborated quite closely and became very close. We were close friends. He was probably, I don't know, 15, 20 years older than me. So more of a father figure to me, honestly, especially because I was in my 30s at the time. But it's not like the church isn't already introducing the possibility of that kind of a situation by nature of callings. I mean, I found it really funny. I haven't thought about these things for a long time, but my memory was that there was one sort of taboo bottom line in ward mixed gender leadership connection. I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of taboos that are obvious, but it was driving in the car together. We could sit in the office, in his bishop's office, and have, PPIs till the cows came home, but we could never be in the car together, which back in those days, as more of a sort of traditionally believing person, even then I was like, what happens in a car that makes it different than an office? Completely arbitrary. But I guess there was an acknowledgement there that that is a risk factor. And I suppose in any, situation where women and men are working together and they're heterosexual adults, I think that's always going to be a potential. But then you look at the hopeful reality that women and men as adults are people of integrity, and that those who have integrity are going to call upon that integrity in any and all situations where they're working with people of the other gender. And one would expect that of people of same gender attraction. I mean, it's just, to me, that felt strange, even more strange in the face of my realization that it already is sort of a phenomenon that does unfold, that men and women do work together in some leadership callings. Thoughts on that, Hun?
Yeah. So you're saying two things, right?
Okay.
First, you're saying, number one, we're adults, and it's kind of a weird, just kind of weird to treat us like teenagers. And number two, these things are already happening to some degree in ward councils, especially like bishops and stake presidents. Make the same argument for young men's and young women's presidents, who often coordinate activities. And even before the scouting program was dropped, there were a lot of mixed gender councils that were run in scouting. And so, the more I thought about it, the more I don't think that's it.
Yeah. Well, and the more we talked about it, the more we realized that we're like, oh, wow, that's not it. There's something else going on here. And so as we kind of walk you through our own process, we want to do this sort of in the order of how it sort of unfolded to us, because it wasn't readily available to us the moment we read the thing, and even the moment that we started talking about it. I had mentioned to Nathan in the first episode of this that I did by myself as an Instagram live, I said to him, listen, I would like us to start this episode similar to how I started the first one, which is to sort of walk through what would the what would be the experience of a more devout Latter-day Saint, or as I called it in the last episode, a loyalist, somebody who hears this news and they're not troubled at all about the mixed gender situation. They might like it, actually. And so that was kind of the first foray into our deeper dive into this topic. And so, Nath, why don't you take away, kind of share with everyone, what were some of the things that we were coming up with as we were brainstorming, in the mental space of a loyalist, which, you and I can do fairly easily because we were that 5 minutes ago, right? So what might have we been thinking as a female or a male, looking at that and going, yeah, I love that this is not mixed gender. This is great.
Yeah, well, obviously the first one is what we just talked about, unwarranted sexual tension, I suppose. But I think the other thing that comes into play here is that because the LDS Church is so baked in patriarchy, you could run into a situation where if you had a female counselor under a male president, she would be so used to being one down that she really wouldn't function perhaps effectively as a counselor to a man, because her natural inclinations could be to always defer. And, I'm not going to say that's true for all LDS women, but I think a lot of LDS women might be intimidated working under a man, whereas if they're in an all-female presidency, they might be more willing to speak their mind as a counselor. And then I think the opposite could also be true.
Before you go on.
Okay, go ahead.
I think we should pause there because there's a lot going on there. So a woman in a counselor or secretary role with a president who's also a female may feel more comfortable and confident in true collaboration in a way that she may not in a presidency where a male priesthood leader or priesthood holder is in the president's role. And something that you brought up in our conversation yesterday was Nathan recalled that at BYU, he was called to be the co-ward mission leader with a female. And that's good for them back in the 90s to have a female mission leader. I feel half a mind to go report that to somebody because that feels a little edgy. Just kidding. But you did say that while you two really functioned well together, at the end of the day.
Yeah, there would be times where we would talk about things and maybe not completely agree on things. And then the poor little girl would and I don't remember her name. She's sweet, really sweet lady. But she would finally just say, well, you're the priesthood holder, so you get the final say, which of course means we weren't really co-leaders at that point. But I think that is indicative of the mentality of a lot of women. Not all, but a lot of women would be to say, fine, if we can't agree, you get the final voice.
And I think that matters because when you're looking at a situation where we're trying to give voice to women, but you then set them up again in a situation where they feel like they're just sort of enacting more hierarchy. I get it. And I can see why some women would prefer to be in an all women's presidency so that they could actually practice finding their voice in a counselor situation. So I get that, but that's one piece. That's something that one might feel if they were more of a loyalist and wanting to serve in a presidency. And this is really on the side of women more than anything. We're going to really tackle the other side because I think that there's way more to say about a female president with male underlings. All right. But before we go there, I also was just thinking, were I a loyalist and put in a presidency with men or a man, I think, again, I'm really putting myself in the space of a loyalist who's very traditional. And for me, I was a stay-at-home mom. And I would have had to kind of like work around someone else's work schedule if he were a traditional sort of doing the traditional gender roles. So that would have been inconvenient. And also, as a young mom, I was always very invested in friendships that I found in callings at church. And so I would have been bummed if I had to collaborate with a man or men as a woman. That would have been inconvenient for me and a lost opportunity for friendship. So I'm just being honest here. Like that to me that mattered to me in that era of my life. Okay. This is where we're going to pivot unless you have anything more you want to say, Han? Because I think the other side of the coin is why this policy exists. Okay. So let's just put ourselves in the loyalist mindset of a loyalist man. And we're not going to talk about the man being the president this time. We're going to talk about, in this case, a scenario where a female is a ward Sunday school president. And I understand that we've all kind of established in the first episode, what are they even doing in Sunday school presidency meetings? We don't even know if they actually exist. This might be the first time ever if women start showing up because they'll hold meetings and they'll like be thinking about curriculum and stuff. So we understand that this is sort of a low cost calling situation, but there's a lot of symbolism. There's something very symbolic going on in a space were a woman to be presiding over a man in a presidency. So pretend, Nathan, put yourself back in your sweet little loyalist man space in the Mormon church. And how would you feel if Sister Jones was your president and you are the secretary? You're not even a counselor, you're a secretary.
Yeah. I mean, I think what potentially happens could happen in the mindset of a man who's in a patriarchal system, but is the secretary under an all-female presidency, is that the man would begin to wonder, what's wrong with me? Like if I held the priesthood and this is a patriarchal church, and God picked a woman to be the president and me to be the secretary, there must be something wrong with me. And I think that would be the very natural mindset of shame or guilt or questioning. And then I think again that you get into a problem where I don't think you would work well together, because you're feeling like God has deemed you unworthy in some way, like this is a punishment or something.
And I think that is very, very poignant and quite telling of what happens when something is integrated from very, very early on into the minds of both women and men in an institutional patriarchy, which is this embedded one up, one down dynamic that comes to be accepted in one's identity as a given, right? And so when the order of the universe is disrupted in this moment and a man is called as a secretary to a female president in an institutional patriarchy, I can't imagine many men feeling differently than what you just said, Nathan, that like uncomfortable, off, a little bit embarrassed, maybe a little bit of shame.
Yeah.
Because, and this is what we really want to hone in on here, even though it's a Sunday school presidency in a ward, and we can all acknowledge that this is a low cost calling, and one might even argue, does it really matter? The fact of the matter is, Nathan and I would say it really does matter. It matters enough to where when this came out from the gate, it was anticipated that we cannot disrupt the order of the universe here. We cannot put together a scenario and endorse it, even in the Sunday school presidency, even at the ward level, where a female non-priesthood holder is presiding over a male priesthood holder. It can't happen. Say more about why, Nathan. What is it that we kind of like we're discussing?
Yeah, so this is a very unique situation potentially, because I mean, in the church, there are instances where you have a woman's presidency presiding over men, specifically in the primary. Okay. But what you don't have is any instances where within a presidency, right, where supposedly this group of 3 or 4 individuals are working as a collaborative team to receive inspiration. And the president of that organization is the one who gets to put the final stamp of approval on the collaboration between the team members. We don't have anything like that really yet. And obviously we still don't, because they didn't do it. But to me, the reason why that's important is because they still want people to understand that the priesthood presides. In other words, in a collaborative relationship, the priesthood always gets to put the final stamp of approval on collaborative revelation, right? So the most obvious example is a ward council, where the bishop is still the one who gets to put his stamp on any collaborative revelation within the ward council. But the one that really jumped out to me when we started down this path was the home, the family. And I think, and I'll just go ahead and say it, and I'll let you, build on it. But I think personally that they are afraid, talking about the first presidency and the Quorum of 12 Apostles, they are afraid that if we created a council like a Sunday school presidency, where a woman presided over a priesthood holder and she got to put the final stamp of approval on collaborative revelation, and that's kind of how you and I defined presiding, right? To preside means that you get to put the final okay on collaborative revelation. So if you created that in the Sunday school presidency, to me, the immediate problem becomes the proclamation on the family, where it says husbands and wives are equal partners, but the husband presides, meaning that husbands and wives have the same responsibility and right to receive revelation for the family, but it is the husband that gets to put the final stamp of approval on whatever collaborative revelation you come up with. And so if you suddenly open the door where a Sunday school presidency, a woman can put her stamp of approval on a man's revelation, or take it away and say, no, I disagree, the immediate question becomes, well, why not in the family? Why can't the woman be the one who puts her final stamp of approval on the family revelation? And I think that's what they're most afraid of personally.
So a couple things that I want to touch on, because I want to come back to the family, because I think that's a big deal, and maybe like a pivot to like really focusing on that. But before we do that, what comes up for me as I listen to you, Nathan, is that when you put a scenario together where, say, for example, this presidency is having a meeting and deciding how to, I don't know, arrange the curriculum or decide what they want people to be teaching and talking about in Sunday school, which I think is a lovely idea, right? To have the input of women and men. God bless this. Well, except for it's not happening. So in my like scenario in my head, it's like, oh, but they're not. So I digress. But pretending what they do, and Secretary Nathan has some really good ideas and he's very excited about them and he feels good about them. But President, in this case, President Valerie, right? Say we're in the same presidency together. I appreciate those. We listen, we counsel together. And at the end of the day, I say, I want to think about this and take into consideration everything that you have all said, which I do earnestly. And I come back and I decide that we're going to go a different direction. That may be something that we'd already talked about that isn't, the exact opposite of what Nathan said, but it's not what Nathan said. Okay. So this is a piece that I think matters. I am using divine revelation, my own connection with God, for the betterment of my ward. And I'm doing it with love. I'm doing it with the Spirit. I'm doing it in a way that is collaborative in nature to serve humankind. What makes that different than priesthood? Right? I may not have keys per se, but that's a whole other conversation. I just wonder if I start having experiences presiding, counseling, listening, but then trusting my own internal divine without then handing it back to a man to decide whether or not it's quality revelation, then I might become confident enough to recognize that I think I am practicing the very thing that has been reserved frequently, at least at a superior level, to men. Does that make sense, Nathan? That it like puts women in a situation and men in a situation to even start questioning what even is the priesthood. Mm-hmm. Because I've already said on this podcast, and I stand by it, that I believe that either all of us have it or none of us have it. Right. But it's the power of God to act in their name, because I believe that we are divine and we are emanations of God. And so, of course, we all have the priesthood, and this thing that is given to one gender is a human construct. And the more I experience what this feels like from the perspective of leadership, the more I probably step into what is real about it. And it makes me more uncomfortable with the status quo of what the church is defining as a limitation that I have because of my gender.
Right. So again, we've talked about kind of two things. One is that it calls into question in any scenario, the ability of a woman to preside over a man. And secondly, it could call into question then the very definition of priesthood. If a priesthood holder is, if the revelation and inspiration of a priesthood holder is subordinate to the final say of a woman, it could call into question the very definition of what it meant for that man to hold the priesthood. So rather than addressing these questions of what happens if a woman gets to put her stamp of approval on collaborative revelation that includes men in that council, and would that apply to other scenarios like the home, it also brings into question, well, what is priesthood then? If the woman can do it without being a priesthood holder and she can trump a man who does hold the priesthood, well, then what is the priesthood? So yeah, I think we're looking at two really deep existential questions that the church dodged,
right,
on purpose.
Yes,
by not doing this. And there's more, by the way. That's not the only existential question that they've dodged, but yes, go ahead.
Yeah, love that. And to me, this is a perfect point to sort of pivot to a focus on the family, which is that I've been reading a lot about the 80s, and that is, anyways, I digress. It's a Christian nationalist, sort of an opening organization. But to focus on this question of how might this translate over into the home and the family, Nathan, this is so funny because even to this day, we have conversations, and it's so interesting what each of us internalized from our history and what we took from and internalized, having been, raised our whole lives in and lived our whole lives in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Nathan was starting to talk to me about the difference between keys and what was the other word you used?
Priesthood duties or responsibilities.
Yeah. So priesthood duties and priesthood keys. And he was sort of helping, but he was talking, like breaking these down as there's a difference between priesthood duties and priesthood keys. And a Sunday school president, male, has duties but not keys. And he's kind of like parsing this out to me. And I'm looking at him like, Nathan, I don't like, and maybe this is me, y'all. Maybe this is not like every woman's experience in the church, but like, I wasn't privy to nor very interested in that kind of splitting of hairs because it didn't involve me. Meaning that when a woman is taught from very, very young that she can't participate in whatever that game is over there, I'm not really all that interested in learning the rules of that game because it isn't my game. I'm not allowed to play. However, I will say that when he started, because I was kind of saying to him, I don't know that this matters because like keys, duties, blah, 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 who cares, but the more he walked me through it, the more I thought, oh, actually this does matter because I think it plays into why this is falling, like why it's like going the way it's going, why this happened. Do you want to like explore that a little bit more, Nathan? Are you tracking where I'm going?
Yeah, no, I am. And I know the conversation. So yeah, so when we talk about the way that the church is run, there are kind of two different arms of priesthood leadership. Okay. One arm of priesthood leadership is defined in our Doctrine and Covenants, and it has to do with very specific callings, okay? Bishop, stake president, apostle, prophet, elders quorum president. Those are the big ones, okay? Those callings are defined in the scriptures as being specific priesthood callings, and they have what are called priesthood keys, which means that they get to preside over groups and have trump power on things. Okay. We've already touched on that, like the bishop and the ward council. Okay. But apart from bishop, stake president, apostle, prophet, and elders quorum president, there are a lot of things in the church that have been designated as priesthood responsibilities, but it doesn't come from our scriptures. And a really good example of that was witnesses at baptisms. Okay. For a very, very long time, women could witness at baptisms. And then one of the prophets decided, no, that's a priesthood responsibility. And those were his exact words. They took it from women, gave it to men. And then, of course, recently, the church gave it back. But the problem is this. The priesthood keys, and in this case, we're talking about the apostles and the prophets, they get to control what we decide are priesthood responsibilities. So up until 2 weeks ago, the Sunday school presidency was a priesthood responsibility. That's not defined by revelation. It's defined by the key holders. And then they decided 2 weeks ago, we're taking that back. That's no longer a priesthood responsibility. Now, if you took away all the things in the church that have been just arbitrarily labeled as priesthood responsibilities, like mission service, passing the sacrament, preparing the sacrament, witnessing, saying the opening prayer in church meetings. These are some arbitrary things that have been designated as priesthood responsibilities. You could give all those to women. You could. And maybe we're headed that way. And that's what they did 2 weeks ago, is they gave up one of those. They gave up one of those power points, one of those power positions. They gave it up. Okay. That's good. And we should give up all the power positions that we possibly can. But you have to remember that even giving up those positions of power, giving up those priesthood responsibilities, is still being run by men, by these key holders.
Okay, so two things I want to touch on in response to what you said. Number one, it brought to mind a term that I'm going to borrow from when I was, or as I've been putting this little Latter-day Struggles platform together over the last couple of years, we were putting a website together, and one of our web consultants said, Valerie, your website is experiencing what we call in our industry feature creep. Like you just add more and more and more things slowly until next thing you know, it's bloated and you have so much there. So I'm going to like borrow that word and call this power and control creep. So even if we just have those 5 or 6 like designated key holder items, I'm not even here to say I'm a fan of those. But what I am here to say is that where it began and how power and control creep has taken over in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints over the last almost 200 years is extraordinary. If you start really looking at what used to be the roles and responsibilities that women had, even without priesthood keys, but they had plenty of other participatory responsibility and power and voice that has disappeared. And so now what we're experiencing in moments of this nature, in some ways, is the relinquishing of some of the priesthood, what we're sort of taken and determined to be priesthood duties or responsibilities that never, ever had anything to do with priesthood keys. And if I were to invite you to go back to the first episode of this little series, arguably, this is potentially in the direction of moving towards gradually giving many, if not most, if not all, of these responsibilities back because they never were theirs in the first place, right? As far as key holding. But what Nathan says is actually very, very important too. In order to really achieve true health and equality in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, one gender will not ultimately have any power over the other gender. In other words, the question of keys needs to go away as well. And that, we're a long way off from that. And so you have to give back that which you illegitimately took first before we can even start having the conversation about keys. And that, I think, unless you have anything else to say, I want to pivot back to the family here, because there's nothing in any Mormon theology or handbook that I'm aware of that gives any man priesthood keys to preside over the family. That's once again, if I'm not mistaken, I'm looking over you, that is once again sort of a made up construction. You know what? I'm going to double back a little bit. I don't think that's Mormon in nature. I think that we've inherited that from patriarchal Western Christianity.
Right. I mean, there is a scripture in the New Testament that people quote, which says that the man is the head of the woman as Christ is the head of the church. And so they use that as their justification for a patriarchal home system independent of priesthood keys.
Right. And so, and you could even go as far back as how culturally informed and molded we as human beings really are by the garden narrative, at least in, the 21st century Americas, right? Like we are very, very, whether, you believe in Christ at all, if you're an American, you have been defined in many ways by the garden narrative and what it proclaims supposedly about gender, and that the man is over the woman, and that the woman, needs to be guided and directed and presided over. And so the aha moment I'm having at the moment, Nathan, is that I don't think there's any Mormon specific theology that says the man is to preside over the woman in the home or the children. Wouldn't you agree? There's nothing there that says that. That's more just garden variety Christian theology, but Mormonism seems to have co-opted that and officialized it, but not key oriented. That has nothing to do with like the priesthood keys of Mormonism.
Right. I mean, I think that was part of why the proclamation on the family became such a problem for some people, is because that was the church's attempt to make something official. And maybe there are statements earlier. I don't know. I'm not a church historian. So, I can't really speak to what prophets have said in the past to get us to this point. But I mean, the proclamation of the family is sort of our glue on this now.
Yeah.
That the man is to, preside in love and righteousness in his family. And again, preside means get the final say. I mean, let's be honest. That's what preside means, is it gets the final say. And so it has been cemented independent of keys. And this is, I think, one of the questions that they didn't want to have to address.
So you're saying when were a woman called into a presidency as the president and chooses one or more of her presidency to be men and practices with her spiritual gifts, presiding and leading and conducting in some ways that is disrupting the template that perhaps the institutional patriarchy does not want disrupted. They don't want a disruption of the template that the man always presides in every setting, and most certainly in the home. And when we were like processing this last night, something else that occurred to me that may be completely peripheral and not on the minds of the brethren as they were putting, this policy together. It did occur to me that this is the soup I'm swimming in, which is probably why this came up for me. But it did occur to me that so much of what is going on in the spiritual growth and development side of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which is all you out there listening, those of you who are in this liminal space, who are in a faith journey and asking hard questions, claiming your authority, maybe for the first time in your whole life, in so many situations, not all, but in many situations, guess who's leading out in the marriages? It's the female. It's the female partner who is showing divine leadership in her wrestles as she is evolving to further on stages of faith. And I just wonder if what the brethren didn't want was a woman gaining her voice and finding confidence in service that's oriented around leadership and coming home and saying to a more devout husband, I think my revelation counts.
Yeah. And I mean, I would hope that women could always say, I think my revelation counts. But the problem is that the husband still holds the final veto, even if a woman feels that way. And so so again, I think we're talking, we got to, let's go back and kind of map this. We're talking about the breadth and the extent of these priesthood duties, and then we're talking about the depth of control which comes from the priesthood keys, right? Let me just use one more example that you and I talked about and I forgot, but it is under Joseph Smith, women were giving blessings of comfort and healing all the time, right? And then somebody designated the use of the giving a blessing to a child is not a family responsibility, it's a priesthood responsibility. And so they took from women what Joseph gave. Joseph gave it to them. They took from women the ability to do, ministering and anointing with oils and things like that. That's a priesthood responsibility. Let's just be honest. Joseph gave it to women. Somebody took it back. I don't know, probably Brigham or one of the Joseph Smith, Hiram Smith descendants. You can almost always blame patriarchy on some of those famous names, but they took it back. And what that means is that we could still give it back again. But until we also address the bigger problem, which is that even those decisions of what we're going to give back or take back are still unilaterally in the hands of men, it'll never quite be right.
Yes. So the blessing example is a good one. Such a poignant example of power and control creep, right? And I guess we'll just kind of close today with just leaving you to ponder these things, because as I mentioned in the first episode, I actually want to ask you, Nathan, I don't think the church is going to die on the hill of women's issues. I think actually it may be after I'm dead, but I think I will die before the church does on women's issues.
Yeah, I would not be shocked in the next 10 years if we see little girls getting to pass the sacrament, help prepare the sacrament,
Wow.
Even if they, giving moms the ability to participate in the baby blessings.
10 years?
Wow. I think that the church is going to move. I think they're going to have to systematically go through the things that are not designated in the scriptures. And I think they're going to have to give them back slowly, one, little here, little there, because I think that women are waking up too much to be like, no. So I think the church is going to give those back.
The duties and responsibilities that are the result of power and control creep.
Yeah, right. That are not specifically defined in the 20th section of the Doctrine and Covenants. For instance, I mean, the 20th section of the Doctrine and Covenant says that you have to hold the priesthood to bless the sacrament, right? To administer the sacrament. But there's nothing about preparing, and there's nothing about, who can hand it out. And those are the kinds of things that I think are going to have to be given up eventually. And then once that's done, I do think eventually the church is going to have to address the problem of keys and putting women on the highest councils of the church. I just don't see any way around it. Well, I'm with you.
And I think if they don't, then attrition will take over.
Yeah, because anywhere else in the world, women can go out and hold their own and be, in equal society. So I was just looking at this the other day. In the Fortune 500 companies, it's about 15% women CEOs. Now, I know that doesn't sound like a lot, okay? But 20 years ago, it was 1%. The business world, the government, local school boards, I mean, everything is moving towards equality. We're going to get our first female president of the United States at some point. The rest of the world's already had female prime ministers. We've got senators, we've got governors, we've got mayors, school board presidents, principals. Everywhere else in the world, women can look around and say, I can do anything a man does. I can hold any position except in the church.
Maybe not everywhere else in the world, but maybe in the first world.
Yeah, maybe in the first world. But my point is that that's how everything is moving. The arc is moving towards this equality. And women aren't going to sit around and be like, oh, I'm okay with it in the church. They sense that there is a reform coming. And if the church doesn't have it in them to say, yeah, we've got to fix some things, then you're right. It's either going to go away, but I don't think it will. I think you're right. I don't think the church is going to die on that hill. I think that women will continue to progress in this area until there is inequality.
So what we're looking at here is potentially the reversal of power and control creep in very unimpressive, underwhelming ways. And then at that point, I suspect the hope would be that would satisfy the women enough, and it won't. And the progressive, liminal, feminist men will not be satisfied. And then we'll have to see what happens, because you have, duties, responsibilities, which is the result of power and control creep. And then on the other hand, you have keys. And so that will be obviously the last domino to fall if it does. But either I think that domino will fall, or the church will fall, or at least become a blip on the radar, very inconsequential, because a church that doesn't have women is not going to be a church much longer, because we are the procreators, right? We're the ones that bring about the babies. And so if all the women aren't coming at some point in time, then the butts in the seats will do a lot of the talking. And so we'll just have to wait and see if this is a gradualist approach. I'm not really here to say I think there's a strategic gradualist approach going on, like Abraham Lincoln's was back in the day, but I think necessity will bring about the demand for a gradualist approach, even if what we experience for the most part is near enemy in nature. So I think there could be some sort of a cocktail of both going on. So, and we get to live to see much of it, right? We're getting to be on the front row, and God bless the opportunity that we have to be a voice of reason and hopefully a voice of inspiration and love as we speak, but speak with compassion and try to do this in a way that is respectful of the earnestness of all parties involved, because we are all divine, doing the best that we can in different stages of development. And so to that end, we try to love and respect everyone, but we also want to speak about what we see and how we see it. So thank you all so much for your love and support. And we'll talk to you next time. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to Latter-day Struggles. If this podcast has supported your faith journey, we invite you to explore the many ways you can continue your healing and growth with us. On our website, you'll find support and processing groups, marriage and parenting courses, and free resources to support where you are in your faith journey. You can also join Valerie in the live fellowship gatherings throughout the year, where we connect, process the podcast, and build meaningful friendships with others on similar paths. If cost has ever been a barrier, we offer podcast scholarships funded by listener donations. To explore all of these offerings, visit the link in today's show notes or go to latterdaystruggles.com. And if this podcast has been meaningful to you, leaving a 5-star review is one of the most powerful ways to help others find this work. Latter-day Struggles is proud to be part of the Dialogue Podcast Network.
Dialogue Podcast Network.